At 7:05 p.m., a hotel atrium full of people became a structural test no one had agreed to run. A fourth-floor walkway fell onto the second-floor walkway below it. Both dropped into the crowd. 114 people died. The fatal change was not hidden in the steel after the collapse. It was visible months earlier on a shop drawing. One rod became two, a load path changed, and a connection that was already weak was asked to carry twice what it had been designed for. The system did not recognize the revision as a redesign until the atrium floor did. To understand how that could happen, start with the room everyone came to see. The Hyatt Regency, Kansas City, opened in July 1980. The atrium was the architectural centerpiece, roughly 145 feet long, 117 feet wide, and 50 feet high. The suspended walkways were a deliberate visual feature. They were meant to be seen. They crossed the atrium at the second and fourth floors, attached to the ceiling structure above by vertical hanger rods, and they gave the space the feeling of movement and scale that the design intended. The structural system for those walkways was not unusual. Suspended walkways carried by hanger rods were a known engineering solution. The design called for a series of rods running vertically from the ceiling framing, passing through the box beams of the fourth-floor walkway, and continuing down to the box beams of the second-floor walkway. In the original design, each rod was a single continuous element. It ran from the ceiling connection, through both levels, with a nut and washer bearing against the underside of each box beam. The logic of that system is worth pausing on. In the original configuration, the fourth-floor box beam carried only the fourth-floor walkway. The nut at the fourth floor bore only against the dead load and live load of that structure. The weight of the second-floor walkway was carried separately, further down the same rod, at a different bearing point, closer to the load itself. This matters. Keep it in mind. During the shop drawing phase, the period when a fabricator translates a structural engineer's design into construction-ready drawings, Havens Steel, the steel contractor, raised a practical concern. The original hanger rod design required threading a single rod for nearly its full length so that a nut could be seated at both the fourth floor and second floor connections. Threading a long rod is difficult. The threads are vulnerable to damage during installation. The fabrication was inconvenient. Havens proposed a revision. Instead of one long rod, use two shorter ones. The upper rod would run from the ceiling to the fourth floor box beam. A second rod would run from the fourth floor box beam down to the second floor. On paper, this looked like a minor adjustment. The geometry was nearly identical. The walkways would hang in the same positions. The visual result was unchanged. A shop drawing reflecting the revision was submitted to the engineering firm for review. It was approved with no load recalculation. Here's what the revision actually did. In the original design, the fourth floor box beam connection carried one walkway. In the revised design, the upper rod terminated at the fourth floor box beam, which meant the fourth floor connection now had to carry both walkways. The second floor walkway no longer hung from the same rod below the fourth floor. It hung from the fourth floor structure itself. The load at the fourth floor connection did not increase marginally, it doubled. The connection, a nut and washer bearing against the bottom flange of a box beam fabricated from two channel sections, was not redesigned to accommodate this. No one performed an independent calculation of what the revised detail was now being asked to hold. To understand how this happened, you have to look past the revision itself. The revision was the mechanism of failure. But 5 separate conditions had to be true for it to pass through the system unchecked. The first, ownership of the revision was ambiguous. On a large construction project, shop drawings pass between the fabricator and the engineer of record. The engineer's review stamp is typically understood as confirmation that the drawing conforms to the design intent, not a full independent check of every detail. The fabricator's role is to propose practical solutions. The engineer's role is to catch problems. In practice, this split creates a gap. When Havens submitted the revised raw detail, the question of who was responsible for verifying the load path had no clear answer. The fabricator had proposed a convenience change. The engineer had stamped the drawing. Neither party had performed the calculation that would have immediately revealed the problem. Ownership of the revision was distributed in a way that in effect meant no one owned it completely. The second, the change was framed as fabrication convenience, not redesign. Language matters in engineering review. A fabrication accommodation moves through a system differently than a structural revision. The first category implies that the intent is preserved, and only the method is adjusted. The second implies that the behavior of the system may have changed and needs to be verified. The revised raw detail was categorized, implicitly, as the first kind of change. It looked like a threading convenience. It was presented as a threading convenience. The framing suppressed the question that should have been asked. Does this change the load path? It did. Substantially. The third, no independent load calculation was performed on the revised connection. This is the clearest failure in the chain, and it is also the most structurally important. The Kansas City building code at the time required walkway connections to support twice the expected live load. The original design, even before the revision, only met roughly 60% of that requirement. It was already undersized. The revised connection, which doubled the load on the fourth floor bearing point, dropped that margin to roughly 30% of the required capacity. Had anyone run the numbers on the revised detail, a straightforward calculation, not an advanced one, the deficiency would have been apparent. The check was never performed. The revision moved through approval as a drawing, not as a structural change that required structural verification. The fourth, earlier warning signs during construction did not trigger deeper scrutiny. In October 1979, during construction, a section of the atrium roof collapsed. The failure was attributed to a connection problem and addressed. Construction continued. This is not an uncommon pattern in large projects. Partial failures during construction are investigated, corrected, and treated as isolated events, rather than signals about system-level weakness. The roof collapse did not prompt a review of the walkway design. The two events were categorized separately. When warning signs are absorbed as individual incidents rather than read as evidence about the overall margin of the system loses its best opportunity to find problems before they become failures. The fifth, the original design had insufficient margin, so the revision made a vulnerable system lethal. Every failure has a threshold. The Hyatt walkways were not hovering at adequate margin when the revision arrived. They were already below code. The revised connection did not push a safe system into danger. It pushed an already deficient system into certainty. This is a recurring pattern in structural failures. The final cause is often not the only cause. The thing that triggers the collapse is frequently acting on a structure that has been accumulating vulnerability from the beginning. The redesign doubled the load. The original load was already too much. The Kansas City Hyatt walkway collapse was investigated thoroughly. The engineering firm lost its licenses. Lawsuits proceeded for years. The revision was identified quickly as the proximate cause. But the investigation also surfaced something harder to resolve. No single person had made a decision to approve an obviously dangerous structure. The revision had moved through a system. Each handoff had occurred within its expected category. No one had acted with obvious negligence in their own framing of what they were reviewing. The structural failure was not hidden. Any engineer who ran a load calculation on the revised detail would have found it immediately. The failure was hidden from the process, absorbed into a category labeled routine before it could be evaluated as structural. This is what the shop drawing process was designed to catch. This is exactly what it failed to catch. When we tell this story as a single cause failure, we miss what it actually demonstrates. It is tempting to say, someone should have checked the math. That is true. But it is not sufficient, because the math was checkable at every stage by multiple parties and was not checked by any of them. The question that explains the failure is not who forgot the calculation. It is why the system did not require one. A revision that changes the load path of a life safety connection is a structural redesign. It does not matter that it was proposed as a fabrication convenience. It does not matter that it looked geometrically similar to the original. The moment the load at the fourth floor connection doubled, the detail had to be evaluated as if it were new. The system had no reliable mechanism for recognizing that moment. In software, this is a known failure mode. A patch that seems local turns out to have non-local effects. In medicine, it appears when a drug interaction is missed because two prescribers are reviewing the same patient separately. In regulatory systems, it appears when a rule written for one era of scale gets applied to a structure the rule was never designed to cover. The form is always the same. A change is framed in a category that does not require deep review. The category is wrong. The system has no way to know it is wrong, because the category itself is the gate through which the change passes. The Hyatt Regency walkways did not fail because someone chose to cut corners on a calculation they knew was necessary. They failed because the process had been organized in a way that made the calculation feel unnecessary. And no one in the chain was positioned to see the whole picture clearly enough to know otherwise. 14 months after the hotel opened, the atrium was full of people on a summer evening, standing on and below structures that could not hold them. The shop drawing that approved the revised connection had been stamped and filed. The construction was complete. Inspections had been passed. Everything was in order. That is not a reassurance. That is the problem. What failed in Kansas City was not the calculation. Calculations were never the bottleneck. What failed was the system's ability to recognize when a change had crossed a category boundary, when something labeled routine had become structural, and when the margin that should have absorbed the error had already been spent. The walkways were compliant in the sense that they had passed through every required gate. They were lethal in the sense that no required gate had been designed to catch this particular kind of failure. The revision that killed 114 people was a drawing change that went through normal channels in normal time and was approved by people doing what their role required. The system worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Next time, another design failure, another system that taught itself to ignore what it already knew.
Specificity and rank define the order, but fragile architecture can't hold water. It's a cascade of forgotten code. A heavy legacy begins to overload. A cascade.